In most people's minds, a stable society looks like this. People aren't desperate. They aren't panicking. They aren't protesting in the streets. Life looks fine. Jobs still exist. Cities are still busy. Cafes are still full. The system keeps moving. From the outside, nothing appears broken. And that's exactly why this phase is so dangerous. Because the most effective systems don't survive by forcing people to stay. They survive by making every alternative feel worse, not illegal, not forbidden, just irrational. In earlier stages of decline, systems rely on pressure. They raise costs, they stretch debt, they compress wages. People feel it. They complain. They try to adapt. But eventually, a more subtle shift occurs. The system stops fighting people directly. Instead, it begins removing exits. You're not told you can't leave. Leaving just becomes financially reckless. You're not told you can't change careers. Failure just becomes irreversible. You're not told you can't start a business. The margin for error simply disappears. Choice still exists, but viability doesn't. And when alternatives stop feeling viable, staying starts to look like maturity, like responsibility, like realism. This is the phase where systems no longer need force because people begin policing themselves. In the last video, we talked about learned helplessness, about what happens when people stop believing that good decisions exist in practice. That was the psychological layer. But learned helplessness doesn't stay personal for long. Once enough people internalize it, the system adapts. It learns how to operate without resistance, without outrage, without confrontation, because when people believe that all options are bad, they stop demanding better ones. This is where modern stagnation lives, not in collapse, not in chaos, but in a calm, orderly world where nothing improves and no one quite remembers what improvement felt like. And this is the illusion we're going to break apart today, because the most dangerous systems aren't the ones that trap people openly. They're the ones that survive by quietly removing alternatives. When people imagine loss of freedom, they usually imagine prohibition, rules and bans, force. But modern systems rarely work that way. They don't remove options directly. They remove conditions. You are still allowed to choose. You're just no longer allowed to fail. And that changes everything. In a healthy system, alternatives don't need to be perfect. They just need to be survivable. You can try something new and recover if it doesn't work. You can make a mistake without permanently falling behind. You can experiment because the cost of error is limited. That's what makes choice real. But when a system wants to stabilize itself, it doesn't eliminate alternatives. It increases the penalty for choosing wrong. Slowly, quietly, incrementally, failure becomes expensive, then dangerous, then irreversible. And once that happens, freedom becomes theoretical. Let's take housing-dominated economies. On paper, you can still move cities. You can still change jobs. You can still start a business. You can still take time off. Nothing is illegal, but the cost of getting it wrong has been quietly raised. If you move and misjudge the market, you don't just lose time. You lose years of accumulated stability. If you change careers and stumble, you don't just reset income. You risk permanent precarity. If you start a business and fail, you don't just learn a lesson. You destroy your ability to re-enter the system on decent terms. So people adapt, not by becoming passive, but by becoming conservative. They don't ask, what could I build? They ask, what mistake can I least afford? And that question is the beginning of exit removal. Because exits don't disappear. When they're blocked, they disappear when they become too risky to touch. This is why modern stagnation looks voluntary. People choose to stay in bad jobs. People choose not to start families. People choose not to invest in themselves. From the outside, it looks like preference. From the inside, it's constraint. The system doesn't need to tell people to accept less. It just needs to make every alternative path feel like gambling with your future. And humans respond rationally to that. They don't rebel. They don't flee en masse. They optimize for safety. They cling to what they have, even if it's shrinking. Because when downside risk becomes asymmetric, rational behavior changes. In that environment, stability stops being a foundation for growth. It becomes a cage, not locked, just dangerous to leave. And once enough people internalize that logic, the system gains something powerful. Predictability. People stop testing boundaries. They stop probing alternatives. They stop creating pressure for reform, not because they agree with the system, but because survival now depends on compliance. This is how exits disappear without ever being closed, and why systems that reach this phase can look calm for a very long time. Once exits become dangerous, something subtle happens. The system doesn't call this a problem. It calls it responsibility. People who stop taking risks get praised for being realistic. People who delay life decisions get described as prudent. People who accept shrinking futures get labeled as mature. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable. After all, in a risky environment, avoiding risk looks smart. But this is where the logic breaks, because responsibility only makes sense if the system itself is healthy. In a healthy system, being cautious preserves value. It protects something real. In a distorted system, being cautious doesn't preserve value. It preserves damage. Let's look at how this shows up. Young workers are told they're being smart by waiting. Waiting to buy, waiting to have children, waiting to move, waiting to take chances. But waiting only works if time improves conditions. When time makes things worse, waiting is not prudence. It's slow erosion. Yet the language stays the same. Be patient. Don't rush. Now isn't the right moment. Those phrases assume a future payoff. But in housing-dominated systems, the payoff keeps moving away. So patience stops being a virtue and becomes a trap. The same thing happens with work. People are told to value stability over ambition, to hold on to safe jobs, to avoid unnecessary risk. And again, that sounds sensible until you realize that the safe path no longer builds leverage. It only maintains position. You're not moving forward. You're just trying not to slip backward. At that point, stability stops being strength. It becomes fragility, because a system where everyone is afraid to move is a system that cannot adapt. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This kind of stagnation gets defended by the people inside it, not because they like it, but because acknowledging the problem would force them to admit something painful, that the sacrifices they made didn't protect them, that the caution they practiced didn't lead to security, that playing by the rules didn't deliver what was promised. So the story shifts. Instead of saying, the system is failing, people say, this is just adulthood now. Instead of asking, why does nothing compound? They say, this is what responsibility looks like. And once that story takes hold, pressure for change disappears because the system no longer looks broken. It looks grown up. But mature systems don't trap effort. They channel it. They allow people to take risks because the downside is survivable. They reward initiative because success compounds. A system that demands permanent caution is not stable, it's brittle. And brittle systems don't collapse loudly. They quietly stop producing futures. This is why the most dangerous phase comes after outrage, after protests fade, after debates cool down, after people stop demanding better. What replaces anger is rational acceptance, and rational acceptance is the system's strongest defense. Because once stagnation feels responsible, no one fights it anymore. They just manage it. When alternatives disappear, the damage doesn't show up immediately. Systems like this don't fail fast. They slow down, and slow damage is much harder to detect. The first thing to go is innovation. Not because ideas disappear, but because ideas require risk. Starting something new only makes sense when failure is survivable, when the cost of getting it wrong is temporary. In systems where exits are dangerous, failure isn't a lesson. It's a permanent setback. So people stop trying. They don't stop thinking. They stop acting. Ideas stay private. Projects stay hypothetical. Innovation becomes a hobby and not a path. Next comes demographic damage. People don't stop wanting families. They stop believing they can afford long-term commitments. Children require stability, time, predictable futures. When futures feel unstable, people delay. Then delay becomes cancellation, not out of selfishness, out of risk management. A society that removes alternatives also removes confidence, and confidence is the foundation of every demographic decision. Then growth itself changes character. The economy doesn't collapse. It becomes maintenance-driven. Most activity goes into preserving existing structures, servicing debt, protecting assets, managing exposure. Less energy goes into creating something new. Growth still exists on paper, but it's circular. Money moves, but nothing fundamentally changes. This is why these systems can look successful from the outside. GDP rises, markets function, institutions remain intact. But internally, the engine is no longer generating momentum. It's recycling it. And recycled growth doesn't create opportunity, it just sustains hierarchy. Over time, this produces a specific kind of inequality. Not just income gaps, but option gaps. Some people retain flexibility and they can fail and recover. Most cannot. And once flexibility becomes scarce, power concentrates automatically. Not through conspiracy, through structure. This is also why reform becomes so difficult. At this stage, any meaningful change introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is terrifying in systems where error is punished. So people resist change, even when they know the system is broken. Not because they love it, but because they're trapped inside it. A system that survives by removing alternatives eventually faces a paradox. It becomes very stable and very fragile. Stable as long as nothing changes. Fragile the moment external pressure arrives, because systems that don't adapt internally can only adjust when forced from the outside. History is full of these moments, long periods of calm, followed by sudden breaks. Not because people were unaware, but because they had no safe way to respond earlier. This is the price of stability without choice. It delays conflict, but it amplifies consequences. And that leads to the final question. If removing alternatives creates calm but kills progress, what does a system do when it reaches that point? How does it survive next? There is a reason. Systems that remove alternatives often look peaceful. Nothing is exploding. Nothing is collapsing. Nothing demands immediate attention. Life continues. And that calm is deeply misleading, because calm created by opportunity and calm created by constraint are not the same thing. One is chosen, the other is endured. When people stop pushing boundaries, the system interprets silence as consent. When people stop testing exits, the system reads compliance as stability. And because everything appears orderly, there is no urgency to change. No visible crisis, no political shock, no single moment that forces recognition. Just a long stretch of normality where nothing improves. This is how systems survive. Past the point where they should have evolved. They don't fix underlying problems. They manage behavior. They don't expand opportunity. They make alternatives unsafe. And as long as people keep functioning, the system keeps going. But survival is not the same as health. A system can survive while quietly consuming the future, while draining ambition, while compressing choice, while training people to expect nothing better. And because this process is gradual, it often goes unnoticed until the effects are irreversible. This is why the most dangerous question isn't, is the system stable? It's, why does stability require making alternatives impossible? Because systems that rely on constraint to maintain order cannot handle renewal, they cannot absorb disruption, they cannot adapt internally, they can only persist until something external forces change. And when that moment arrives, it doesn't arrive gently. Systems that removed exits find themselves with no safe adjustments left. People don't know how to move anymore. Institutions don't know how to respond. Everything was optimized for stillness. The tragedy is that none of this required malice. No single decision caused it. It emerged naturally once opportunity narrowed and risk became irreversible. People behaved rationally, the system did not. This is the final stage, before stagnation becomes destiny, not because people gave up, but because the system stopped offering paths worth taking. In the next video, we'll look at what happens when people stop trying to escape entirely. When they don't just accept the cage, they learn how to survive inside it. How systems begin to depend on trapped populations to maintain the appearance of normality. If this helped you see how stability can exist without progress, subscribe. Not for outrage and not for easy answers, but for clarity. Because once you understand how alternatives disappear, you can decide whether staying is a choice or just the absence of one.